The door slammed so hard the porch light flickered. 1 second I was standing in the doorway asking a question. The next, my suitcase hit the wooden boards at my feet, and my mother's voice cut through the cold night air like a blade. "You don't live here anymore, Avery." I heard the deadbolt turn. That sound, that small mechanical click, was the loudest thing I had ever heard in my life. I stood there in the freezing November air staring at a door I had walked through 10,000 times. My hand went up automatically and I knocked. Then I knocked harder. "Mom. Mom, open this door." Nothing. I could hear movement inside. A step. Then my brother Marcus's voice, low and amused, and the unmistakable sound of his phone camera clicking on. He was filming me, standing on the porch of my own house, knocking like a stranger, while my brother recorded it for his own entertainment. Then my father's footsteps came down the hallway. Heavy. Deliberate. He opened the door just wide enough to look at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger exactly. Something colder than anger. "This was never your house," he said. And he closed the door again. I stopped knocking. I looked down at my hand. The key was still there. I stood on that porch for a long time. The cold was the kind that gets into your bones slowly, like it has all night and knows it. The street was quiet. One neighbor's porch light was on across the road. I could see the curtain shift in the window next door. People were watching, but nobody came out. My suitcase sat beside me, packed like they had planned this. Like somebody had gone through my room while I was at work and decided what belonged to me and what didn't. My toiletries were in a plastic bag sitting on top of my folded clothes. They had even packed my phone charger. That detail hit me harder than the slamming door. This wasn't a fight that got out of hand. This was organized. I picked up the suitcase and walked to the edge of the porch steps. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always did. Same oak tree at the corner. Same cracked sidewalk I had ridden my bike over as a kid. Same mailbox with the dent in the side from when my father backed into it 3 years ago. Everything the same. Except I was outside and they were in. I breathed in through my nose. Out through my mouth. I felt something shifting inside my chest. Not tears. Not yet. Something else. Something quieter. I whispered it out loud just to hear myself say it. "They locked me out of the house I've been paying for." Then I pulled out my phone. Not to call them. To call someone else entirely. "My name is Avery Cole. I'm 27 years old. I work in property administration for a mid-sized real estate firm downtown. My job, in the simplest terms, is to manage paperwork that other people find complicated. Lease agreements, ownership structures, co-signature clauses buried in the back of documents that most people sign without reading. I find the details others miss. It's what I was trained to do and what I am genuinely good at. People who know me professionally would describe me as calm, reliable, the kind of person you call when something needs fixing quietly. I don't make scenes. I don't raise my voice. I show up early and I stay late and I make sure everything is in order before I leave. People who knew me at home would probably have described me the same way. The one who kept things running. The one who handled what nobody else wanted to handle. The one who made it easy for everyone else to forget that things were being handled at all. I lived with my parents because it made sense. 'Cause the house needed me. Because I told myself that family meant showing up even when it cost you something. For 3 years I believed that. Standing on that porch with my suitcase, breathing cold air into my lungs, I finally understood what I had been too close to see clearly. I had made it easy for them to forget what was mine. Because 3 years ago, that house almost wasn't theirs anymore. It started in the winter, 3 years before that night on the porch. I had come home for a weekend visit and found my mother sitting at the kitchen table staring at a stack of envelopes she hadn't opened. The kind of envelopes you recognize immediately, even before you see the bank logo in the corner. The kind with red ink on the outside. My father was in the living room. The television was on, but he wasn't watching it. He was just sitting there with his hands on his knees looking at the wall. I opened the envelopes myself. The mortgage on the house was 4 months behind. There were late fees stacked on top of late fees. A formal notice from the bank had arrived 2 weeks earlier, warning of foreclosure proceedings if payment arrangements were not made within 30 days. That deadline had already passed. My parents hadn't told anyone. Not me, not Marcus, not a single person. They had just been sitting with it, hoping something would change. I spent that whole weekend on the phone with the bank. I went through their finances line by line. I found a restructuring option, a co-signature arrangement that would allow the mortgage to be renegotiated under more stable terms. It meant adding my name to the paperwork. It meant my credit, my financial history, my name attached to the property going forward. My mother held my hand across the table and said, "We'll fix this together." My father signed the restructuring papers without reading past the first page. There was a clause on page 7. They never got that far. After that weekend I moved back home. It made sense on paper. The restructuring required active financial management. Someone had to make sure payments were made on time, that the insurance stayed current, that the property taxes didn't fall behind again. My parents were not bad people, but they were not organized people. And the evidence of what happened when nobody was watching was still sitting in a stack of unopened red envelopes. So I stayed. I paid the monthly mortgage contributions from my salary. I handled the property tax filings. When the roof developed a slow leak above the back bedroom, I hired the contractor, negotiated the rate, and paid the deposit. When the water heater failed in February, I replaced it. When the city sent a compliance notice about the garden fence height, I dealt with it before my parents even knew it arrived. I did all of this quietly, the way I did everything. And still at dinner my father would make small comments about my job being behind a desk, about how property administration wasn't a real career the way his work had been. My mother would redirect conversations away from anything I achieved, toward whatever Marcus was doing that week, as though my contributions were the air in the room, necessary but invisible. Once, when I mentioned the mortgage refinancing, my mother looked at me over her fork and said calmly, "Don't confuse helping with owning, Avery." I said nothing, but I remembered it. The argument that led to the lockout didn't start loudly. It never did in our house. The worst moments always began quietly, like a car engine ticking before something breaks. It was a Sunday afternoon. I had been going through the household files and noticed that my father had been receiving letters from a property consultancy I didn't recognize. 3 letters over 2 months, all addressed to him personally. I left them alone the first time. The second time I saw one, I asked him about it at dinner. He said it was nothing. A general inquiry. He waved his hand the way he did when a conversation was being closed. I let it go that night. A week later I found a 4th letter. This one had been opened and put back in the drawer carelessly, the way people put things away when they're not expecting anyone else to notice. I could see enough through the folded edge to recognize what it was. A preliminary property valuation request. I brought it to the dinner table the following evening and I placed it beside my father's plate. "I'm asking for transparency," I said. My voice was even. I had practiced staying even. My father looked at the letter. Then he looked at me with an expression that I now understood had been building for a long time. "You think this house is yours," he said. And just like that, the door to the argument swung open and everything that had been waiting behind it came pouring out. The argument lasted 2 hours. Not 2 hours of constant shouting. 2 hours of the kind of conversation that pauses and restarts, where people leave the room and come back angrier, where things get said that were clearly being saved for exactly this moment. My father said I had overstepped, that I treated their home like a project, that I made them feel managed inside their own walls. My mother went further. She said I had always had a way of making people feel indebted to me, that I did things expecting gratitude and then punished people when I didn't get it, that my help always came with an agenda. I sat at the table and I listened to all of it. Marcus leaned against the kitchen doorframe with his arms crossed, nodding slowly like a man watching a film he had already seen. I waited until there was a pause and then I said one thing. "I have my name on this mortgage. I have legal standing in this property. I have a right to know if you're planning to sell it." My mother's eyes went hard in a way I had never seen before. "You're replaceable in this house," she said. That was the sentence. That was the exact sentence that shifted something inside me permanently. Not because it was the cruelest thing she could have said, but because of how easily it came out. Like she had thought it many times and was simply relieved to finally say it. I sat very still. And I realized in that moment that they were completely serious about cutting me out. I went back to the porch in my memory. Standing in the cold. My suitcase beside me. Marcus's phone camera pointed at my face. The deadbolt turning. I stopped knocking, stood still for another full minute, and then I picked up my bag and walked to my car. I put the suitcase in the trunk with the same careful movements I used at work when I was managing something difficult. Low. Deliberate. I sat in the driver's seat and held the steering wheel. My face in the rearview mirror looked exactly the way I felt. Not broken. Not falling apart. Just very, very clear. The kind of clear that comes when emotion finally gets quiet enough for your brain to take over. I picked up my phone and I scrolled to a contact I had not used in personal matters before. Contact I knew through work. A property and contract advisor named Theodore Briggs who had helped my firm navigate a complicated co-ownership dispute 18 months earlier. Typed a message. I need to review a property agreement. Urgent. I watched the screen. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then his reply came through. Course. Is this about the house that's in your name? I stared at those words for a moment. He already knew more than my parents thought anyone knew. Type back yes. Then I started the car and drove away from the house without looking back. My friend Diane lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city. She opened the door when I knocked, took one look at my face, and stepped aside without asking a single question. That kind of friendship, the kind that reads the room and doesn't perform concern, is rarer than people realize. She set a mug of tea on the coffee table in front of me and went back to her room and left me alone. I didn't cry. I had expected to, and then I didn't. I sat on her couch in the lamplight and felt the evening settle around me. The apartment was quiet in a good way. The kind of quiet where nothing was about to explode. No footsteps overhead. No television voices bleeding through walls. No weight of a house full of managed tension pressing down on everything. After a while I opened my laptop. Not to search for anything. Not to read anything. I knew exactly what I was looking for and exactly where it was. I had kept a copy of every document related to the property restructuring in a private folder I maintained on a secure drive. Work habit. The kind you develop when your job teaches you that paperwork always matters more than people expect it to. Found the folder. Opened it. The ownership structure appeared on my screen in plain black text. I had read it many times before. This time I read it differently. The restructuring agreement was 8 pages long. Most people, including my parents, had focused on pages 1 and 2, where the monthly payment terms were laid out in simple language. Clear numbers. Clear dates. Easy to understand and easy to sign. Pages 3 through 6 covered liabilities, insurance requirements, and the conditions under which the restructuring could be reviewed. Standard language. The kind that sounds important but feels remote when you're stressed and relieved and just grateful the bank isn't taking the house. Page 7 was different. It contained 3 things that my parents had never discussed with me after signing, because as far as I could tell they had simply never read it. First, my co-signature gave me a documented financial interest in the property. Not symbolic. Legal. Second, any major financial decision regarding the property, including sale, required my written authorization before it could proceed. Third, there was a clause protecting my position if I had been the primary contributor to mortgage payments over a sustained period. 3 years of bank records would show exactly what I had contributed. I sat back and looked at the screen. They needed me to sell. They needed my signature. They needed my cooperation. And they had just packed my belongings into a suitcase and recorded me being shut out in the cold. I whispered it quietly to the empty room. They never read this. I almost closed the laptop and went to sleep. Almost. Then something made me open my email instead. Not my personal account. My work account, which I had access to through the same secure drive. I had received a forwarded message 3 weeks earlier from a property listing contact who thought I might recognize an address. I had saved it without fully understanding why. Opened it now. It was a preliminary listing inquiry. An estate agent asking about availability, timeline, and expected market value for a residential property in the neighborhood where I had grown up. The address was the house on Larkin Street. My parents' house. My house. The email was dated 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks before the argument about the property consultancy letters. 6 weeks before my mother told me I was replaceable. 6 weeks before my suitcase landed on the porch. I scrolled further and found a second email, a reply sent from my father's personal account. He had confirmed interest in a preliminary valuation. He had provided access details for the property. He had written one line at the bottom of the email that I read 3 times. Current occupant situation will be resolved before listing. Current occupant. That was me. I was the current occupant situation. The thing to be resolved. The fight hadn't caused the plan. The plan had always been there. The fight was just how they moved me out of the way. I sat with that email for a long time. There was a stage in my childhood where I used to make excuses for my parents automatically. When my father didn't show up to my school events, I told myself he was tired. When my mother chose Marcus's side in arguments without hearing mine, I told myself she didn't understand the full picture. I had spent a very long time interpreting their behavior in the most generous way possible. The email on my screen made that impossible. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a family that had made a bad decision under pressure. This was a deliberate plan, made 6 weeks in advance, to remove me from a property I had financially anchored for 3 years, without telling me, without compensating me, without acknowledging that my name was on the paperwork that protected their ability to keep the house in the first place. They had planned to cut me out completely. Closed the email. Closed the laptop. I sat in Diane's quiet apartment, and I felt something settle inside me like a stone dropping to the bottom of still water. I was done protecting them. The decision didn't feel dramatic. Didn't feel like revenge. It felt like finally choosing myself after years of choosing them first. I picked up my phone and called Theodore Briggs. He answered on the second ring. Theodore was the kind of professional who never sounded alarmed, which was exactly what I needed at 11 o'clock at night. I told him everything in the order it happened. The foreclosure, the restructuring, the 3 years of payments, the letters I found, the email, the lockout. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me to send him the restructuring agreement and the email I had found. 20 minutes later he called back. "Avery," he said, "your position here is stronger than you probably realize." He walked me through it calmly and clearly. Because of my co-signature and my documented financial contribution, I had legal standing in the property. That meant a sale could not legally proceed without my written authorization. If my parents had made representations to any estate agent or potential buyer suggesting the property was solely theirs to sell, they had potentially misrepresented the ownership structure. That created a separate problem for them entirely. "What can I actually do?" he asked. He told me. I could file a formal notice asserting my legal interest in the property. This notice would appear on the property's record and alert any buyer or agent conducting due diligence. It would effectively freeze any unauthorized sale. I could also withdraw the financial authorizations tied to the mortgage restructuring, which would trigger a bank review. Then he asked me the question I needed to hear. "If you act, what happens to them?" I looked at the ceiling of Diane's living room. "They figure out what they actually built their plans on," I said. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was upset. Because my mind was working the way it works when I'm deep inside a complicated file at work, turning details over, checking timelines, making sure there are no gaps in the sequence. Old habit. By morning I was certain. No second guessing, no softening. I called Theodore at 8 and gave him the instruction. By 10:30 he had drafted the formal notice asserting my legal interest in the property at Larkin Street. It was clean, precise, and completely factual. It stated my co-signature status, my 3 years of financial contribution, and the clause on page 7 requiring my written authorization for any sale to proceed. It was sent to the relevant property registry and copied to the estate agent whose email I had found. No angry letter. No confrontation. No announcement. Just documentation, moving through the proper channels the way documentation does when someone who understands the system decides to use it. I was at Diane's kitchen table eating toast when Theodore texted me. Notice filed and confirmed. I put my phone face down and finished my toast. 22 minutes later my father called. I let the first call ring out. And the second. On the third I answered. My father didn't say hello. He didn't ask where I was or whether I was safe after a night outside. He started speaking the moment the call connected, the way people do when they have been rehearsing what they want to say and are afraid of losing the script. Why did we get this notice? His voice was controlled, but only barely. Because you locked me out, I said. Avery, this is not. You locked me out of a property that has my name on the ownership paperwork, Dad. The notice explains the situation. Was the kind of pause where someone is recalculating. What exactly did you do? He said. His voice had changed. The controlled part was gone. What replaced it was something I had never heard from my father before. Not anger. Not authority. Something thinner than both of those things. Uncertainty. He didn't understand the mechanism yet. He knew something had been filed, something official and serious, but he didn't know what it meant or how far it reached. He was asking me to explain it so that he could figure out how to undo it. I thought about the email. Current occupant situation will be resolved before listing. Read page 7 of the restructuring agreement, I said. Then you'll understand. I ended the call. 15 minutes later my mother showed up at Diane's apartment building without being invited. I don't know how she found the address. Marcus probably helped. He was good at that kind of thing, appearing helpful while serving whoever had the most power in the room. I came down to the entrance because I wasn't going to let her into Diane's space. My mother was standing on the front step in her good coat, the one she wore to important occasions, which told me she had chosen this outfit deliberately. She wanted to look composed. She wanted to frame this as a conversation between reasonable people. She started with her eyes. My mother had a way of making her eyes go soft and wounded simultaneously, the way people do when they've practiced looking hurt in mirrors. You're destroying this family, she said. I stood in the doorway with my arms at my sides. No, I said. I stopped holding it together. Her expression flickered. The soft wounded look was replaced for just a moment by something sharper. She tried a different approach. She said she understood I was hurt. She said the lockout had been an overreaction and things had gotten heated. She said families went through difficult periods and the important thing was to come back to the table. And then, when none of that moved my expression, her voice changed. She said if I didn't withdraw the notice, they would consult their own legal advisor and fight my claim on the property. That was the threat underneath everything. I nodded once. Okay, I said. Do that. I went back inside. That evening Theodore called me with an update I hadn't expected. While conducting additional due diligence on the property record, he had found something. The estate agent my father had been corresponding with had already taken the next step. The property at Larkin Street had been listed on a private internal database used by high-end buyers. Not a public listing, but a pre-market placement. The kind done before a property officially goes up for sale, to generate interest quietly. That pre-market placement had gone up 4 days before the argument. 4 days before I had placed the consultancy letter beside my father's dinner plate. My father had listed the house before the fight even happened. The fight hadn't been a breaking point. Had been a performance. A way to justify removing me from the property before the listing became public. If I left on bad terms, appearing to be the difficult one, the story was cleaner. But there was a legal problem with that pre-market listing. Because it had been submitted with a declaration of clear ownership, meaning my father had represented to the agent that he was the sole decision-maker on the sale. That was factually incorrect. My name was on the restructuring agreement. He had made a misrepresentation to a licensed estate agent. That wasn't just a family dispute anymore. Theodore explained it carefully. I realized I wasn't just blocking a sale. I could stop everything completely. I want to be honest about this part. There was a moment, sitting in Diane's apartment with my laptop open and Theodore's voice calm in my ear, where I asked myself whether I was going too far. Not because my parents deserved mercy, but because I needed to be certain I was acting from a clear place, not a wounded one. The difference between those two things matters. Wounded decisions crack under pressure. Clear decisions hold. I thought about the email. Current occupant situation will be resolved before listing. I thought about my mother's voice when she said I was replaceable. I thought about 3 years of mortgage payments, property taxes, contractor fees, insurance renewals. 3 years of keeping a house standing while the people inside it called me a burden. I thought about my brother filming me on the porch. I thought about page 7, the clause they never read. I was not acting from a wounded place. I was acting from a place of complete, unblinking accuracy. I told Theodore to proceed with full enforcement. He filed a formal challenge to the pre-market listing, citing the misrepresentation of ownership. He triggered a mandatory financial review through the bank, flagging the missing co-signature authorization on the proposed transaction. He submitted documentation of my 3-year contribution history to support my standing under the conditional ownership clause. The sale didn't just slow down. Stop. The next 48 hours moved in a way I had seen before in work disputes. Slowly at first, then all at once. The bank flagged the account on the second morning. A mortgage with a co-signatory could not proceed toward property transfer without a review confirming all parties had been properly notified and had provided authorization. My father had not sought my authorization. The review was automatic. The estate agent suspended the listing immediately. When a property's ownership status was under active review, no licensed agent would continue a transaction. The liability was too high. The buyers who had expressed preliminary interest through the pre-market placement were notified that the timeline was uncertain. One of them withdrew interest the same day. I know all of this because Theodore was thorough in his updates and because I asked for every detail. Information had always been my sharpest tool. I was not going to stop using it now. By Wednesday afternoon, the bank had sent formal correspondence to my father's address requesting a meeting to clarify the ownership structure before any further steps could be taken on the account. My phone showed 7 missed calls from my father, 3 from my mother, 2 from an unknown number I suspected was Marcus. I didn't answer any of them. I went to work. I sat at my desk. I did my job with the same focus I always brought to it. And I waited for the moment the structure I had built became impossible for them to ignore. My father called again that evening. This time I answered because I could hear in the first ring, even before his voice, that something was different. The phone rang differently when someone is frightened compared to when they're angry. I know that sounds strange, but it's true. Urgency has a different sound than authority. He didn't perform composure this time. He didn't open with accusation or demand. He just said my name. Avery. I'm here, I said. This is serious now. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. The voice of a man who has been told something by a professional and is still processing what it means. The bank called. They want a meeting. The agent. He stopped. Started again. The listing is frozen. I know, I said. We might lose the house. The words came out slowly, like they were costing him something just to say. If this review goes badly, if the bank decides the restructuring was mishandled, we might lose the house. I sat with that sentence for a moment. Not with satisfaction. With something more complicated. The house was where I grew up. The oak tree at the corner, the cracked sidewalk, the dented mailbox. All of it still mattered to me, even now. But they had made their choices with clear eyes and deliberate intention. Then you understand why page 7 mattered, I said quietly. He didn't respond. Dad, you understand now. 2 days later my father called a third time and this one was different from all the others. He didn't start with the bank or the listing or the legal review. He started with a question I had not expected. Did you know we were planning to cut you out completely? Not a denial question. Like he was checking whether I had known before the lockout or only found out afterward. Like the answer would tell him something important about where we were now. Yes, I said. I found the email. Silence. The one where you told the agent the occupant situation would be resolved, I said. More silence. Longer this time. He didn't explain it. He didn't apologize. He just said, everything's confirmed then. Flat. Resigned. Like a man who has run through all the possible exits and found them all locked. Then, an hour later, something arrived that I had not anticipated. Marcus sent me a video file with no message. No explanation. Just the file. Opened it. It was the recording from the porch. Him filming me from the doorway while I knocked. My father visible just inside. My mother's hand on the deadbolt. In the background, clearly audible, my mother's voice saying, "She'll have nowhere to go." And my father's reply, unhurried, certain. "By the time she figures it out, it'll be done." I watched it twice. Then I saved it to my secure drive alongside page 7 and Theodore's enforcement documents. I watched the video a third time that night. Not to confirm anything. I had already confirmed everything. I watched it because there is something about seeing the truth plainly. Not filtered through memory or family mythology or the softening that happens when you love people. That completes a process inside you. I had spent 3 years telling myself the situation was complicated. That my parents were flawed but not cruel. That the imbalance was unintentional. That if I just stayed patient and kept contributing and didn't make things difficult, something would shift. In the video, I was standing outside knocking. My mother was already laughing softly at something my father said. My brother kept the camera steady with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his head. They had not been blind to what they were doing. They had understood it completely and done it anyway. Something settled in me watching that video. Not anger. Not grief. The kind of quiet that comes at the very end of a long argument when every word has been said and the truth is just sitting there in the open, no longer requiring defense. Closed the video. I opened Theodore's contact and typed, "Move to final enforcement stage." He replied within the minute. "Understood. I'll have everything filed by morning." I set my phone down and looked at Diane's ceiling. By morning the structure my parents had built their plan around would be fully, formally, and irreversibly in my hands. The legal outcome landed on a Thursday. Theodore walked me through it by phone while I sat in my parked car outside the office building where I worked. He spoke in the methodical, clear way that made me trust him. No drama, just sequence. The bank's review had confirmed my co-signatory status and my documented contribution history. Under the terms of the restructuring agreement, my written authorization was required for any sale to proceed. Without it, the transaction was invalid. The misrepresentation to the estate agent had been formally noted. The agent had already distanced from the listing entirely. The pre-market placement was gone. The buyers who had been approached had been informed the property was not available for sale. My father's financial standing with the bank had been affected by the review. Not permanently destroyed, but damaged in the way that required time and clean documentation to repair. Time he didn't have if he was counting on a sale to resolve other pressures. He couldn't proceed without me. That was the complete legal reality. Not approximately. Not partially. Completely. Thank Theodore. I sat in my car for another minute watching people walk in and out of the building in front of me, carrying coffee cups and laptop bags, living their ordinary Thursday. Then my phone buzzed. A message from my father's number. 4 words. "We need to meet." We met at a cafe on neutral ground. My choice, not theirs. They were already seated when I arrived. My father and my mother side by side without Marcus, which told me they had made a deliberate decision about how they wanted this to look. Muller. Less like a confrontation. More like parents. My father looked like a man who had not slept well in a week. My mother's hands were folded on the table with the careful stillness of someone keeping themselves controlled by effort. I sat across from them and ordered coffee and did not say anything first. My father opened with the house. He said the bank review had created serious complications. He said the listing was completely stalled. He said they were in a difficult position financially and that they needed resolution. I listened. Then he asked the question, "What do you want?" I'd thought about this. I had been thinking about it for a week. Not what I could take from them. What I actually needed the situation to become. Acknowledgement, I said. And proper legal control over what's mine. I placed a single document on the table between us. Theodore had prepared it. It outlined a formal co-ownership agreement, replacing the informal restructuring arrangement with something that accurately reflected reality. My financial contribution recognized in writing. My authorization required on all major decisions. A buyout clause if either party wished to exit the arrangement in the future, with fair market valuation. They looked at the document. Then they looked at me. They had no power left to negotiate from. They signed. I didn't move back in. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect the end of a story like this to involve return. A scene where the family gathers in the kitchen and something is repaired and the house becomes a home again. That wasn't what happened. That wasn't what I wanted. I found my own apartment 2 weeks after the meeting. A one-bedroom on a street with an old oak tree at the corner that reminded me, in the best possible way, of a neighborhood I no longer needed to fight to belong to. The co-ownership agreement meant the house on Larkin Street could not be sold, rented, or transferred without my authorization. My financial contribution was formally recognized. My position was protected by paperwork that said exactly what reality had always been, just in language no one could overlook. Marcus apologized via text. A short message, carefully worded, the kind of apology that protects the sender more than it gives anything to the recipient. I read it and moved on. My father sent me one longer message a month later. He said he understood he had mishandled things. He did not use the word sorry, but I could see him trying to get close to it. I replied briefly and left the door open a small amount, because I am not interested in permanent war. Only in permanent clarity. My mother has not contacted me directly. I keep Diane's number at the top of my favorites. I kept my copy of page 7. They locked me out thinking I had nowhere to go. What they never understood was that I was the only reason they still had a place to stay.